Give it about 1 second. Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of Physicians for Social Responsibility Climate Emergency Film Club. This session is on permafrost. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really excited for today's panel. I'm really excited to have all of y'all in attendance. While everyone gets situated and gets a drink of water and gets ready for the presentation, I'm just going to go over a couple of things in advance of our panel. So my name is Kevin Richardson. I am with Halt the Harm Network. We're helping PSR Pennsylvania host tonight's event. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about us before we dive into the program. So once again, thanks for joining us tonight. A little bit about Halt the Harm. We're a network that connects people across the country who are fighting oil and gas pollution at the local, state, and national level. We're a really great group of grassroots leaders. And we operate a really awesome network that has a message board that's a great place to connect with other leaders, as well as to learn about the latest that's happening in the movement, both from the local fights going on, as well as the big national news. So I encourage everyone here to check out Halt Harm Network and give it a look and join and sign up to see the latest that's happening across the country. We also set up a special discussion space in our network for the Climate Emergency Film Club series. And that's a great place to continue the conversation after our webinar is done, and also in anticipation of the next 3 in the series. So I'll drop a link to the network and to that discussion space in a moment. And I invite all of y'all to go in there and add stuff to it. And one last thing I'll mention, we like to help groups like Physicians for Social Responsibility Pennsylvania to host webinars like this. So if you're interested in having a webinar hosted, feel free to reach out to me. My email is kevin@halttheharm.net, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. But we are always happy to help folks get the word out about what they're doing to stop oil and gas pollution, to help fight climate change, and uplift other people in the movement across the country. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to pass it over to Marie DeMarco from Physicians for Social Responsibility Pennsylvania, who's going to MC us tonight. So Marie, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Marie DeMarco, and I am a health educator and medical advocacy coordinator at Physicians for Social Responsibility Pennsylvania. I'm super excited to be here with everyone tonight. Just some background about me. I have a specific interest in health equity, health policy, and the social determinants of health. Again, I would like to welcome everyone here tonight to our permafrost session on emergency feedback loops. This session is going to be recorded and will be sent out after the session is completed or at some point tomorrow. And also this session does count as CME credit, and I will drop an email in the chat where we can have that accredited to physicians in this conference. And I'll send that out after the session as well. Again, thank you to everyone who could make the meeting, and we will hold all questions until the end. And if you do have any questions at all, you could always put a question in the chat and I will keep note of them at the end. And with any other pressing matter, you can also drop that in the chat. And that's all I have for right now. But I'd like to pass it off to Alan, and I'd like to introduce Alan. Alan is a retired physician and healthcare executive currently living in Northern Delaware, and has practiced primary care medicine and is also a medical group manager in Connecticut. He came to Delaware in 2006 to be an executive at Christiana Care System, and his healthcare interests include population health, health equity, and the social determinants of health. As an environmental activist, he focuses on the connection between air quality, climate change, and health. He is the president of the National Physicians for Social Responsibility and a member of the Advisory Council at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, and a co-founder of the Mid-Atlantic Alliance for Climate and Health. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alan. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Just to clarify, I'm a past president of National PSR, but which was a good experience, but a couple of years ago. So we're going to get into our panel very quickly. I just want to be sure everybody knows that one of our panelists, Lisa Winter, is in Alaska, someplace north of Fairbanks. There's apparently bad weather there, Earlier today, she said she's having trouble with internet connectivity. We're not sure she's going to make it or not. If she does, we will put her on someplace out of order, probably, or potentially in the agenda. If she doesn't, we have a short video from another person who has been working on the ground in Alaska, an Alaskan native. And we'll also expand the discussion for a few minutes more if Lisa doesn't make it. So first I'm going to introduce Dr. Max Holmes. Max is the president of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, which was previously called the Woodwall Research Center. So in the film that you previewed, that's what the center was called. Max is motivated by a vision of science that connects people with each other and the natural world, and then makes a positive impact on society. His passion includes developing collaborative community-based river research programs, such as Science on the Fly, that unites fly fishing and science communities to study and protect rivers around the world. So if you're a fly fisher person and you want to know how to be a citizen scientist, get in touch with Max. He's done this, in this country and around the world, as I said. He's also co-leader of what's called the Global Rivers Observatory, along with folks from the Woods Hole, HUI, Oceanographic Institute. His research is global, from the Siberian Arctic to the tropical Amazon, and focuses on how climate change impacts water and chemical cycles. This evening, he focuses on our concern about the vast quantities of ancient carbon held in Arctic permafrost, which may be released as it thaws, exacerbating global warming. So Max, your turn.
All right, thanks very much for that introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and have a discussion with this group that you've assembled. I love talking about permafrost. I love talking about climate change, and I love bringing in, well, having people come from different angles. And so it's exciting to be part of this event tonight. Just a little bit more about the Woodwell Climate Research Center, where I am. So we're a research organization, as the name suggests. Our focus is on climate change. We're essentially a bunch of, I'd say, really good scientists working on this issue. But I think what kind of makes us special is not only do we do really good science, but it's sort of in our DNA to try to do something with the science. So it's not enough for us just to do, write scientific papers that other scientists read, but we really like to try to move the needle with respect to hopefully solving climate change. I think maybe evidence of that is, if I'll tell just a little bit about the story of how I got to be the president of this organization. I've been here since 2005 as a scientist. Maybe for the last 5 years or so, I was the deputy director, and then last summer, the president at the time, the president of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, Phil Duffy, got a call from, well, essentially from the president, or at least from the White House, asking him to spend a year in the White House as a climate advisor. So he did that. That year has become extended, perhaps indefinitely. So I initially stepped in as acting president, and then more recently became let's say, the permanent or the long-term president. And so, the Phil's story, that is, a scientist working in the White House on climate policy, is sort of just illustrative about what this organization is about. Our scientists work around the world, both on the ground and sort of using satellite remote sensing to tackle what we think are the biggest, most important issues with respect to climate change. And certainly permafrost and what's happening in the Arctic is way at the top of that list. We also do a lot of work in the tropics. We do a lot of work globally, but yeah, I'll stick to the permafrost story for tonight. And I understand that most, maybe all of you, have watched the film about permafrost. So some of what I'll say will be repetitive, but I think it often helps me to hear things more than once. So I think that's fine. And then I look forward to the discussion that follows. So first, what is permafrost? I mean, the name is sort of self-explanatory. Permanently frozen ground, and sort of technically it's defined as ground that's frozen for 2 or more years continuously. In practice, most permafrost has been frozen for hundreds or thousands of tens of thousands of years, or tens of thousands of years. And why do we care about it so much at this point? Well, if it was, as the name suggested, permanent, we wouldn't be talking about it so much. But the fact is that as the Earth is warming, and the Arctic's warming even faster, 2 or 3 times faster than the global average, permafrost is starting to thaw. And when that happens, the carbon that's contained in the permafrost, and I'll say much more about that in a minute, can be released to the atmosphere, and that can cause more warming. So how much carbon is in permafrost? The best estimates are around 1,500 billion tons. Nobody can really wrap their head around 1,500 billion tons without some context. So how do we put that number in context? Well, all the vegetation on Earth, I'm looking out my window, I'm looking at trees. All the trees on this planet and all other vegetation has about 500 billion tons of carbon. Remember, permafrost has around 1,500 billion tons, so 3 times more than all the vegetation on Earth. The atmosphere right now contains around 850 billion tons. Permafrost thus has around twice as much as in the atmosphere. And fossil fuels, which I'll say a few more words about in a few minutes, left in the ground that we could get to should we continue to go down that route, that is coal, oil, and natural gas, are about 1,200 billion tons. So you might not remember all those numbers, but you should remember the biggest number I put out there was the 1,500 billion tons, how much carbon is locked up in permafrost. So a huge amount of carbon is locked up there. Again, as the Arctic warms and permafrost starts to thaw, this carbon, this organic matter that's been frozen away for thousands and thousands of years, can decompose, essentially rot. It's used as food and energy for bacteria, basically. And the byproduct of that respiration, of that decomposition process, can be carbon dioxide and methane, both potent greenhouse gases. And again, that can cause more warming, more permafrost thaw. And what we worry about, and what the film spoke about, are these feedback cycles, or self-reinforcing cycles, where warming begets more warming. And this permafrost carbon feedback is one of the ones that we worry about the most, given the magnitude of carbon that's locked up in permafrost. What can we do about it? Is there anything that we can do about it? How can we put the brakes on this? I'll say there's not a lot that can be done in the Arctic. Periodically there are ideas that cross my desk. Most of them are pretty far out there. I think maybe we'll come up with something, but really the controls on permafrost thaw are outside of the Arctic, and the controls are the controls on what's driving global climate change in the first place. So number one, that's burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. And secondly, it's deforestation. As forests are cut down and burned, that carbon goes back to the atmosphere, and that can cause more warming. So how do we put the brakes on permafrost thaw and help keep the permafrost the carbon that permafrost contains locked up in the permafrost and out of the atmosphere? We move as aggressively as we possibly can off of fossil fuels, and we do everything we can to protect the forests that we have and restore the forests that we've degraded. We often get the question, is it too late? Is this, have we already kind of crossed this threshold and it's out of our control? The answer fundamentally is no, it's not too late. There's no doubt that we're already experiencing the impacts of global climate change. Anyone who reads the news over the last few days will recognize that, or maybe if they step outside, if they're in an air-conditioned environment, they'll also recognize that. There are heat records being set around the world. Tremendous. We're already sort of facing tremendous impacts. And even if we were to instantly get our act together with respect to tackling those things that we can control, we're going to see more warming in the future. But the difference between what I would say is the best case scenario and the worst case scenario is still tremendous. So, the downside is, we're going to see continued impacts of climate change moving forward. But the positive message, I guess, is there's still a huge impact on the decisions we make as people, as a society, are going to have huge impacts on the trajectory moving forward. And one way I like to think about it is sort of a best case scenario is, there's going to be impacts, future impacts, bigger impacts with respect to climate change, even on a best case scenario. But that world 50 years out there or 100 years out there is still one, or 20 years out there is one that I can imagine my kids and maybe grandkids and, future generations still living good lives and enjoying the environment as we have done. The worst case scenario, should we go that route, is one that I don't even like to imagine. So there's lots of incentive to do everything we possibly can to get on that sort of best case scenario track. I'll say somewhat, well, so far we haven't done it, and we're tracking more along that worst case scenario. So we need to get to work. Just a couple of more comments. One of the things I'm incredibly excited about at the Woodwell Climate Research Center is a very big new project that is just getting launched that we're calling Permafrost Pathway. So if you watch the film, you'll know who Sue Natalia is, one of our scientists here who leads our Arctic program and the permafrost research. And for a couple of years, we were kind of working on a proposal that would go to the TED Audacious program for a big project to get funded focused on permafrost. And we learned last fall that out of the thousands of applications for this award, for this funding, we were one of 10 that got funded. So this project is just launched this spring, and it has sort of three major focal points. One is improving the science of permafrost, figuring out how quickly the permafrost is thawing, how quickly its carbon will decompose, whether it will be released as carbon dioxide or methane. So just sort of doing the fundamental science across the Arctic, and there's still need for that. Secondly is linking that science to policy. And the reality is that the global models that are used to inform global climate policy haven't represented permafrost either at all or certainly not adequately. And that is in large part because there are still uncertainties in the science. So we're working not only to improve the science, but then to connect that science, to the global models, and that will be used to inform the global climate negotiations. And the third part is not only thinking about the global impacts of permafrost thaw, but also looking more locally, and particularly thinking how permafrost thaw is impacting the people that live in the Arctic, live on permafrost, and particularly the indigenous people who've been there forever and who, by and large, aren't responsible for the climate change that we all are experiencing, and they're experiencing to a greater degree, but unfortunately, they're the ones that are paying the biggest cost right now. So we're helping them think about adaptation strategies for managing the permafrost thaw that they're experiencing, and also helping them, if possible, to, well, at least make sure that their voices are heard in the conversation about what needs to be done, and hopefully motivating more aggressive action moving forward. So I'll end there, and again, look forward to the conversation that follows later.
Thanks, Max. Just since we have a few extra minutes on your part, some clarifying questions. One is, you mentioned that even if we stopped the emissions of carbon dioxide and methane now, things will get warmer, or some places will actually be less warm, I think, but climate change will still continue. And so how long that carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere and the methane, how long will that be there if we became carbon neutral today?
Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has a really long lifespan. It's going to be up there for a while. So carbon dioxide that was released from burning coal, when we started burning coal in around 1850, a big part of that is still there. So without some active removal, it's going to be there for a long time. The good and the bad about methane, the bad about methane is each carbon dioxide molecule and a methane molecule each has one carbon. Per molecule, the warming potential, the radiative forcing of methane is much greater than carbon dioxide. So that's the bad news. The good news is that methane has a relatively short lifespan in the atmosphere. Unlike carbon dioxide, it's not there for tens and hundreds of years. It's 10 years or something like that. So that's the positive about methane. but yeah, it's carbon that was released by human activities a year ago or 10 years ago or 50 years ago. Much of it is still there. So yeah, it's not, we don't instantly put the brakes on. And there's also some lags, and it takes a while for the climate system to reach an equilibrium, and we haven't reached that point yet. So again, if we lock the atmospheric concentrations right now where they are right now, it's going to take some time to kind of reach that new equilibrium.
Okay. And one other question for you about forests and trees. Some of us may have seen the New York Times Magazine article this weekend about the 1 trillion tree planting goals. And what the article suggested, or what I've heard suggested, is those, even if we planted 1 trillion trees today, those trees aren't going to help us for the next 20 or 30 years, because it's only as they're more mature, and that the real focus needs to be on maintaining the current forests. To do something right now is to stop cutting trees down. Is that the kind of scientific, or is that just,
No, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. Number one, protect the forests that we have, protect the primary forest that we have. Forests are often sort of considered this renewable resource. If you cut them down, the trees are going to grow back, but that takes a long time. It takes a long time to recover that carbon that you lose when you cut down a tree. So yeah, we got to protect what we have, number one. Number two, restore what we can restore. But again, we've got to, it takes a lot of years and even decades to build up that major carbon store in a new forest and a new tree.
Okay. So I'm going to move on. I don't see that Lisa Winter from Alaska has joined us. So here's what we're going to do, and I beg people's patience here. Well, Lisa is an environmental scientist in the north of Fairbanks, and she works with the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council. And what she does is she travels around communities. She works with citizen scientists to do permafrost and water sampling. She looks at the impact on the food chain, water supply, salmon fisheries, people's livelihoods, and works not to tell people what to do, but to partner with the indigenous communities. And what we wanted Lisa to do is to tell us the impact on the ground for people who live there. I looked this up yesterday, and I didn't know how many people live in the Arctic. And according to Google, over 4 million people live in the Arctic regions of the world. Not all in Alaska. It sounds like the majority, or a lot of them, live in Russia. But that's a lot of people who are being impacted by the Arctic and the areas warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the globe. But we want to queue up a video with another climate scientist who trained under Max. Her name is Darcy Peter. She's a member of an indigenous tribe, and she came to the States to study and to train as a scientist. And now her work is on the ground in Alaska, once again working with the indigenous communities. And she talks passionately about why this is important, not just for the rest of the world and the feedback loops and the cycling that's going to make everybody else feel the effects of climate change, but why she's concerned about her community. And once again, there are 4 million people who are being directly impacted, and none of this was their fault, right? They happen to be up there, and it's carbon dioxide and methane and other things that we're doing in the rest of the world, especially the United States and China, and that's causing them to suffer. So we have an 8-minute video of an interview she did with the Alaskan public television earlier this year. And she's quite impressed, quite an impressive person. See if we can get some sound there. Marie, are you working on the audio?
So sorry, can you guys hear that?
Give us a description of
There you go.
this unfolding in Alaska and what the goals will be going forward.
Right. Well, thank you for having me. So in terms of the goals, I think of Woodwell Climate Research Center being involved in this and working with Alaska Institute for Justice and with our partners. I think a big part of the goal is to get help on the ground for the Indigenous communities that need it. In particular, the ones that are feeling the impacts of permafrost thaw, and communities across the entire state are feeling the impacts of permafrost thaw and of climate change. Permafrost is tied to a plethora of things that are happening on the ground that is impacting their day-to-day life and their way of life as Indigenous people. This goes into food security, it goes into policy, it goes into erosion, it goes into human rights. So hopefully with a science team, a research team, the people on the ground, the Alaska Institute for Justice, for everybody involved, we can get the resources necessary to the people who need them the most, who are experiencing climate change at 3 times the rates of the rest of the world.
You grew up in Alaska in the community of Beaver along the Yukon River and have no doubt witnessed a lot of change yourself. Your bio on the Woodwell Center site says that you believe if research is properly communicated to the public and policymakers, that it can result in policy change. Talk about where you see success in this regard, especially related to climate change.
Right, yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm from the remote village of Beaver, Alaska. It's about 100 miles north of Fairbanks along the Yukon River. And the changes that I've seen just in my lifetime are astronomical. It's very, very daunting to see in terms of food security, safety, just the day-to-day life. And I think that where I personally have seen the most success when scientists work with Indigenous people is in terms of policy. There's a board that I sit on called the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission, and it's one community member from each village along the Yukon River, and we get together and go over each individual proposal, and we go to the Board of Fish and we vote on the different proposals, whether they pass or don't get passed, and that directly impacts our ability to fish. So that's just one example of how science can benefit Indigenous peoples on the ground who might not have a voice at the table, but there are definitely a bunch of resources that can get people around the table where they need to be. So I think policy plays a huge part in this, not only in the sense of erosion and of permafrost thaw, but there are so many different activities and cultural practices that are linked to permafrost thaw that might not be directly linked.
Mm-hmm. Robin, I want to turn back to you. You've described this as a human rights project focused on justice and equity. Darcy was just talking about the concerns around food security and other things. So explain that connection.
Yeah, so the adaptation work that we've been focused at the Alaska Institute for Justice is related to population displacement. And many people have been looking at the international movement of people because of the environmental changes that are happening because of the climate crisis. But there was a report that was issued by the World Bank, which found that the majority of people who are going to be displaced because of the climate crisis are going to be displaced within their countries of origin. And that is significant. And the reason why that's significant is because there is no governance institution, not only in the United States, but worldwide, that is focused to manage the internal movement of people. And as I mentioned, the World Bank's focus on internal displacement in their report, they issued an involuntary resettlement handbook that has been used by governments like India and China to forcibly displace people so that development projects can be built. And that cannot be the model that we use to determine how communities are going to find another place to live if the place that they're currently living becomes uninhabitable. So when I talk about human rights, the most important human right is the right to self-determination. And what that means is that communities make all of the decisions. They make the decision of whether they move, how they move, and where they will move to. And that's why the environmental monitoring is so important, because communities need that information to make these extraordinarily difficult decisions.
I saw the premiere of a documentary on New Talk at the Anchorage Museum this week. They first voted to move in 1996. It was stunning to realize how long they've been working on this. New homes and a school are now in Matarvik, the new village location, but 2/3 of the residents are still in crumbling homes in Utah. As climate change affects so many areas, do you think the federal government has a responsibility to prioritize Native communities that were forced to live in these coastal locations year round? Because the BIA said we're building schools and we're going to build them here, and so now you have to stay here or risk going to jail. Kids won't go to school. Who should be prioritized in this setting where we know California wildfires, hurricanes in Florida? The needs are immense, and they're right now. It's not a future scenario we're talking about. Who should be the priority?
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing up New Talk, because when I decided to go back to graduate school, I did work on, my research was focused on New Talk's relocation. And that's when I realized there was this giant governance gap that prevented the community of New Talk from implementing what the community had decided. And what I mean by a governance gap is there is no state or federal government agency in the United States that has the mandate or funding to facilitate a community-wide relocation if that community makes that decision. And so despite the enormous efforts of federal and state government agencies, as you said, 2/3 of the community is still not in a safe place. And there's no timeline for when they will be in a safe place. And they are currently living in a humanitarian crisis. The community has no running water during the pandemic. And so that's a human rights issue. And it speaks to the urgency of us figuring this out. And in addition, I would mention that the federal government has recognized this gap. There have been numerous reports identifying the lack of federal leadership and the need for federal leadership in order to facilitate a community-wide process. And despite all of these programs being implemented since President Biden took office, there's still no federal leadership in regard to making a governance-wide framework that integrates all the different agencies that need to be involved in this process, like FEMA, like HUD, like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, like the Department of Health and Human Services. So there are all these federal government agencies that have an important piece to play in providing funding and technical assistance to the communities that need these resources. But at this moment, it's extraordinarily difficult to coordinate those resources because each government agency and government grant program has different criteria, different timelines, different budget cycles that make it extraordinarily difficult for a community, any community, to access the resources that they need to be able to get to safety.
Okay, so that went a little longer than Darcy. The other speaker is a social justice and human rights advocate in Alaska. So what we want to get out of at least what Darcy had to say, and I know that some people couldn't hear that well, and hopefully in the recording which will be sent, you'll be able to take another listen to that. I will tell you that Darcy Peter comes back on after that part of the interview, and also continues speaking about the why this is an important issue to her and to the indigenous people. So Max, you are on the ground there in Alaska. Could you just give us a couple of comments or how people can learn a little bit more about what people are facing? You know, my understanding is communities are being moved because of erosion and because of sea level rise, that communities' housing is being built on railroad tracks, basically because the land beneath the housing is slumping, is thawing, and that pollutants or methane and other chemicals are being released into the atmosphere and into the water supply and food supply.
Yeah, all that is certainly true. And if you think of permafrost as frozen ground, a solid surface, it's a wonderful surface to build a structure on, to build a house on, as long as it's frozen. But when that permafrost starts to thaw, the foundation gives way. And what you see around the Arctic is sort of houses sinking into the ground. And that's just a phenomenon that's accelerating. And obviously that's a very bad situation to be in if that's your house. It also impacts ecosystems. You see trees, the same thing for vegetation. And you see trees around the Arctic that are tipping over as the permafrost below them thaws. And it's called drunken forest. That's sort of what it looks like. Other things that are happening, it's not just thawing of permafrost below structures, but it's erosion. It's either coastal erosion in communities along the Arctic Ocean. It's also erosion along rivers as permafrost is thawing, and those erosion, loss of land is forcing some communities to move. They have to relocate, and as was discussed in the interview that you played part of that clip, that's one of the issues they're working on, and one of the challenges is there's just no governance structure in the U.S. or elsewhere to facilitate a community. I mean, you think of Alaska, you think there's lots of space, there's plenty of places to go. The fact is there are all sorts of different jurisdictions, and if you're living in a native community along the Arctic Ocean, you can't just back up because somebody else controls that land. And it's incredibly complicated and hard to solve, and hopefully those solutions will be reached soon.
All right, well, let's go to Steph. I do want to warn Steph and Max, I want to come back in the question period to issues that might involve the physical and emotional health of folks in Alaska. And so give some thought to that. But Steph Lee is a pediatrician with Penn State Health in Reading, Pennsylvania, and is a preventive medicine and public health specialist. Her advocacy work focuses on improving the health of children through climate action and public policy. She works with PSR Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Medical Society, and is also the co-chair of the Climate and Environmental Health Committee of the Pennsylvania chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Steph believes that all children should be protected from environmental hazards and have the right to a healthy, sustainable future. I did ask her to talk about the analogy between the fracking industry and the hazards that imposes upon folks who live in those communities in Pennsylvania, and what goes on in Alaska is happening in Alaska. If you want to help Steph further her work locally, you can connect with her at Steph Lee MD. And Steph, your turn. I know you have a couple of slides to show.
Yes, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Alrighty. All right. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I am, like I mentioned, a pediatrician in Reading, and fairly new-ish to the climate movement, I think, in the last few years. I mostly, talk about children's health and how that the climate impacts, and also how to talk about climate with children, because I definitely think it's, such a big topic. Sometimes you have to really in order to make sure our future generations are educated about it, but not cause too much anxiety, because obviously it's can be a very negative outlook sometimes. So trying to navigate that, as parents, and also, to our patients and things. So today I'll talk a little bit about the healthcare health effects of climate, and also, as Alan had mentioned, a little bit about how that parallels with fracking here in Pennsylvania. So in general, we know air pollution has a lot of different effects for all ages, right? From adults, childhood, even preconception in the womb, and how that relates, of course, to the permafrost is, it's methane and other air pollutants. They can all contribute to ozone smog pollution, right? And so that can also, obviously that contributes to these other effects as well. So in adults, you may see cardiovascular disease, such as, blood pressure issues, strokes, and also premature death, heart attacks, that kind of thing. They also affect directly with the lungs, so it can impair lung function when inhaled, over long periods of time. We know that ozone smog can also trigger asthma attacks, both in childhood and in adults, or like chronic lung disease, as we mentioned, and also affect, because we think of some like inflammatory effects. So things like obesity, diabetes, and even cancer, because of the different air pollutants that are released that can be carcinogenic. And children and the elderly and people with existing respiratory underlying conditions are the most at risk for ozone smog pollution. And sometimes that's something to think about, because a lot of times you want to make sure that the people most at risk are the most protected, right? And what's worse is, like we're saying with methane pollution, it captures a lot more heat and also worsens climate change a lot more than just carbon dioxide. And so there's something that, especially for with permafrost or with other air pollution sources that cause methane, we want to be trying to attack those first. Might give us the most, bang for our buck in a sense. One thing I always like to mention is that children are not what we call little adults. So the physiology is different. So that is particularly why when it comes to climate issues, because a lot of it is air pollution, mainly when we're talking about fossil fuels, that kind of thing. The children are are at higher risk because they have at baseline an increased breathing rate, and so they take in more air per body weight compared to adults. So they actually are exposed more just based on their surface area because of their physiologic vulnerability. And also they also have an increased environmental exposure. So, a lot of times children may be spending more time outdoors, because that's where they play, right? Or if they're littler, if there's, say, for instance, fires, right, and dust, smoke settles, then kids are closer to the ground. If they're littler, they're crawling around, they can get more exposure that way just from direct contact from things that settle, if it's when we're talking about air pollution. And so that's why it's really important to consider that this is also a children's health issue, because they're just a more vulnerable population. So we were talking about how, with the permafrost and melting, right, and how that's related, with the feedback loops, you do have the continued heat. And so, as depending on where you are right now, most of the country is going through a heat wave right now. And so you can say how that is actually an environmental justice issue as well. So because if we do know that in the next few decades, if carbon pollution continues to build in the atmosphere, most of the country will see 20 to 30 more days each year with temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, right? With the southeast part of the US, even potentially seeing 40 to 50 days each year with higher temperatures. So again, children are more at risk because they just can't regulate their body temperature as well. And again, kids or adults with chronic medical conditions are a little bit more prone to heat-related illness. And the last, the bullet point about urban heat islands and why this is an environmental justice issue is because, their urban heat islands are areas that are hotter than surrounding neighborhoods. because they have, little green space, more pollution from air traffic, more air pollution. So those areas may have a higher density of pollution. And then also, if you have less green space, you have more concrete, asphalt that can all absorb heat. And so that increases the risks of having heat-related illness for kids, especially if they're, trying to play outside, trying to get some exercise in. But unfortunately, it's actually more dangerous for them in those situations. And because, they're in urban areas, they can be frequently in the lower income, people of color communities. The last bit, we were talking about, how does this parallel the methane emissions from permafrost to Pennsylvania and what's happening here? So methane emissions, the EPA estimates from natural gas and petroleum and from abandoned oil and natural gas wells are about 29% of the total source of US methane emissions and 3% of the total US greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's definitely something that we need to take a look at because, like I said, if it's such a big part of our emissions, we need to try to slow that down as much as possible, right? And so with fracking, we do see that it may increase risks of adverse birth outcomes, including heart anomalies, preterm birth, and being small for gestational age, so being smaller or low birth weight than what is expected for when they first get born, right? And those are all issues because with babies who are at lower birth rates, either they have an increased risk of issues lower down the as they grow, including breathing problems, neurologic problems, sometimes with development, or with sudden infant death syndrome or SIDS as well. So it's definitely something that can impact you even more than just at the point of exposure, but down the line. And so, and just reiterating, right, that this is something we need to pay attention to make sure that the health of our babies and children and elderly and adults, as well, get as protected as they can against these effects. Some references. All righty. Awesome.
Steph, I wanted to ask a question both for you and Max, whoever feels most comfortable talking about it. And then we'll see what other questions people have. We read in the papers now about, a mastodon skeleton or tusk was found. And isn't this great that the permafrost is thawing? And because we're finding all these things which have been frozen for thousands and thousands of years, and maybe somebody's going to take that DNA and reproduce mastodons. But my understanding is that there's lots of other stuff frozen in the permafrost that we don't particularly want to be re-exposed to. And there were a couple of papers written about an anthrax outbreak a couple of years ago in Siberia that was related to anthrax that had been frozen at least 75 years ago. And now it became unthawed, and a child was playing and developed anthrax, I believe, in Russia, in Siberia, and I believe passed away. So what are these things? Should we be worried about other things, other infectious agents, viruses, chemicals being released from the permafrost? I mean, do we know enough to know whether we should be concerned or not? Maybe Max should speak first.
I can offer a few thoughts, and then Dr. Lee can certainly add to it. I've worked in the Arctic for a long time. I've worked in the Russian Arctic for a long time, and one of the locations that we work is along the Kolyma River, where there's this big eroding riverbank that's probably 100 meters high or something. And every time I've been there, which is maybe 8 different years or something, you walk along that riverbank and you find remains of animals that lived, in this case, around 25,000 years ago. We can radiocarbon date that, so say 20 to 30,000 year old stuff. And it's woolly mammoth. It's lots of other different animals that live there. And yeah, so that's exciting. That same site, there's been some research done where they found ancient squirrel burrows, 30,000-year-old squirrel burrows, and those squirrels did what squirrels do, which is, gather seeds to eat and hide them away for some later time. Well, some of those seeds were still there, and they were able to germinate those seeds, those 30,000-year-old seeds. Some of those have been preserved because remember, this stuff has been frozen for that whole time. And so it was still viable seeds. The same is true for potential human pathogens. And there's that example of anthrax that apparently was in reindeer that had contacted and died. I don't know what, 70 or 80 years ago, something like that. And when the permafrost thawed and that was released, it spread, humans caught it. And I think it, as he said, led to some death. And is there the potential for that to happen more widespread? Yeah, there is. I can't speak as an expert about that, but certainly it's a potential. There's also the release of other chemicals like mercury, and we're doing some work looking at mercury, and that's some of that's locked away in permafrost, and as permafrost is thawing, or that's being released to the environment and it bioaccumulates, and particularly it's impacting communities that rely on fish, for example, it accumulates there. All that being said, and I'll say that these are causes for concern, but it's not the stuff that keeps me up at night at all. The stuff, I mean, it's high risk, let's say maybe low probability. This other stuff is high risk, high probability. Permafrost is thawing, its carbon is being released. That's having an impact. Now it's going to have a bigger impact down the road.
Steph, I know it's probably a little unfair to ask you this question, but do you have any, is there anything on the radar in the medical community now about releasing pathogens? I don't want people to go home and worry, as Max said, pathogens that we haven't been exposed to over the last, since they were frozen away long ago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's anything on the horizon, but I think certainly it is, like Max mentioned, it may not be the thing that we should worry about right off the bat, but I think it's one contributing thing to factor into our decision that we need to work on trying to, decrease fossil fuels because of this effect, right? Because, if there is a new pathogen, something like that occurs, then we, like we saw with COVID when it first started, we're such a global community now, things can travel, really fast between different countries. And just because it's happening, it's being thawed in a permafrost region, it doesn't mean that it's not going to travel quickly to other areas. And then you again may have another global pandemic on your hands, right? It's worst case scenario, but certainly I think that that's something to think about and talk about, because, if there's people, for some reason, they aren't focused on the fact that with the permafrost thawing, that's with the feedback loops, that's not enough for them to get, into this kind of advocacy work, then, maybe the fear of a global pathogen in the future is going to be something that really kicks them on the butt and say, okay, we saw what happened when you have that kind of pathogen, a new thing that happens, and, we know how unprepared we were, and hopefully we'll be prepared again if anything like that ever happens, but definitely something to keep on our radar.
All right, so other Marie, you're monitoring the chat. I did see something pop up from my PSR colleague, Mike Martin in San Francisco, asking Max about fires, peat bog fires, and in the Arctic. So you have any comments on that?
That's super important issue. Fire is increasing really around the world. It's as the earth warms, things dry out faster, and that leads to fires in the Arctic. In tundra environments, fire has been rare historically, but what you have now as things are warming up, snow melts earlier in the spring, the vegetation dries out, both due to that earlier snow melt and hotter temperatures, and that sets up the conditions for fire. Similar thing happening in boreal environments. So forested environments in the Arctic are high latitudes, but also permafrost environments. And when fires move through those environments, as again is happening on a more and more frequent basis, it sets up conditions, and we have sort of active research going on in these areas, but it sets up conditions that accelerate permafrost thaw. So number one, you get a bunch of carbon released right when the fire is happening, but then probably more importantly, or in the longer term, the permafrost thaw is accelerated, and thus the vast amount of carbon that's locked up in that permafrost, more of it ends up in the atmosphere more quickly. So it's bad news. And one of the things that we're looking at are, are there places in the Arctic where fire can be managed? So for the most part, in many cases, the answer is no. It's so remote, there's just no way that you can get out there and try to fight the fires. But there may be places that are particularly vulnerable or carbon rich that aren't so far from places where some firefighting capacity may be, that we can actually go out and try to control some of those fires.
If folks have questions and they don't get answered, please contact Marie. Maybe put your contact information in the chat, and then she'll share it with me, and I'll get it to the right person to get an answer. Marie, I saw at least one other question. What are you saying? What questions do you want to?
I see another question in the chat from Ned. Can you explain how those Siberian methane craters in permafrost form?
In a word, no, but I'll offer some thoughts about that. So first of all, just a little bit about what Ned is asking about. And hopefully many of you have seen this in news reports, or maybe they were in the film, I don't remember now, but there are these, these craters that started popping up, or people started noticing them really quite recently. And they're deep. They look like they formed explosively. So there'll be some soil kind of built up around these things. Most of them that have been found have been in the Siberian Arctic and the Yamal Peninsula. And when scientists have gotten out there, and there aren't many cases actually where scientists have gotten out there soon after these things apparently form, but the methane concentrations in the air or surrounding these are high. The methane in the water that forms and that builds up in these craters is very high. So it seems, and this is outside of an area that I can really speak as an expert, although some of our scientists here are doing a lot of work in this area, but it seems like this explosive process, for whatever reason, and maybe it seemingly is related to permafrost thaw, and it's like the cap goes off, or the ability to kind of contain this built up methane that apparently is built up in these underground. The top blows and you get these craters. We're trying to figure out how many of them are out there. It's not so easy to do because pretty quickly after they form, they fill up with water. And so what they look like is a small round lake. And for any of you who have been in tundra environments in the Arctic, you'll notice that, or you'll know that many of those environments have thousands and thousands and thousands of small lakes. So trying to figure out which ones form through this process of methane craters, versus which ones formed in other ways, is a challenge. But more people are looking and more are being found, and it's kind of this fascinating mystery. Exactly what's causing it? Is this really a new phenomena, or did we just not know about it before? But I think signs probably point towards, or at least there's good reason to suspect that this, if not a new phenomenon, at least is an accelerating one.
So, Steph, I'm hopeful that you're not seeing the spontaneous methane explosions in Pennsylvania, or no, just release of fracking chemicals, I guess. Is that it? There was a question, and the statistics that Max was quoting about the amount of carbon in permafrost, et cetera. What's a good source of that information?
Yeah, I'm trying to think where those numbers are compiled. They're kind of pulled from different sources. We've presented these numbers in various little films and things like that. Let me think of a good kind of a reference where those are synthesized in the form that I presented. Yeah,
send it to me, myself or Marie.
Okay.
I guess we're about to wrap up. I guess one concern that people that I've read about, and I think the film touched on this, is that some of that methane being released now in the Arctic is not just methane at the surface. It's that as things thaw, it's causing cracks that release methane that may have been frozen or organic material that's been frozen for many thousands of years from deeper in the earth. And so that we really don't know exactly how much methane is there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, most of the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane that are being released from thawing permafrost is, for the most part, it's not that you have carbon dioxide or methane locked away in that permafrost. It's that you have ancient organic matter that then decomposes once that permafrost thaws. But there are cases where it actually is methane that's frozen away in the permafrost. One example of that is methane clathrates, and those are generally sort of subsea, below the ocean floor, in regions that previously weren't below the ocean floor. So sea level has risen over the last, let's say 20,000 years, 100 meters. So in the Siberian region, or actually around the Arctic Ocean, you have territory areas that used to be land where there was permafrost and then have been covered by the ocean. And those conditions can lead to the formation of these methane clathrates, what are functionally frozen methane. This is another one of those things that I would put in the category of low probability, high risk. And given that low probability, it's not one of the things that worries me the most, because there are high probability, high risk things out there. But yeah, the concern that you sometimes see some headlines about the amount of methane locked up in subsea permafrost or methane clathrates, and the potential for the rapid release of that. And yeah, it's out there, but again, it's a low probability thing.
All right, so Marie's going to wrap up in a moment. I guess, you know, the hopeful things that I've heard today is that there's a lot of research going on. So we've learned a lot, but there's more to learn, and there's people who are interested in learning that. And also there's work being done in the local communities, and you know, it's not just a bunch of moose and bears and polar bears that we worried about. There are millions of people who live in the Arctic, and there are lots of funding and organizations working to put the indigenous people in the driver's seat to help their future. And that the things that we can do today are decrease the use of fossil fuels and preserve our forests, especially our old growth forests. That's much more important. It's not that it's not important to plant trees, but it's important not to cut them down. And Marie, do you want to, and I apologize, folks, because we've, one of our panelists didn't make it, and I didn't fully edit the film, that clip we showed, but you know, hopefully you were exposed to things that you didn't know about and can help you, everybody take personal action. Marie?
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. I would just like to thank all of the speakers for their valuable contributions to today's webinar, and also like to thank all of the participants for participating in this film club. And I will send an email tomorrow morning with the recording of today's session, information on the CME credit. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me. And thank you all again for coming tonight. I really appreciate it.